My guest today on Creative Inspired Happy is Erin Crosby Eckstine, whose debut novel, Junie, is this month's Good Morning America book club pick. Today, we talk about using family stories as inspiration for a novel, deciding when to insert real history and when to make it flexible in historical fiction, what happens behind the scenes on the set of Good Morning America for author interviews, how writers can prepare for media appearances and publicity events, and so much more. Creative Inspired Happy is a video podcast about incredibly successful writers and others in the book world and how they rose out of obscurity to build fulfilling careers, hosted by me, New York Times bestselling author Evelyn Skye. To join our community and get more writing advice, creativity challenges, the opportunity to ask questions of upcoming podcast guests, and more, follow the link in the episode notes. I hope you enjoy the show. Hey, Erin, welcome to Creative Inspired Happy.
Thank you so much for having me, Evelyn. It's so fun to be here.
I'm really excited to talk to you today. Your debut novel, Junie, this is the ARC, but obviously the finished copies are out in the world. Ooh, there it is. Oh, it's gorgeous. Your debut, I mean, you basically hit it out of the park on your first book that's been published because it was a Good Morning America book pick and you were on the set. I can't wait to talk about that. But first, huge congratulations. Amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been such a great time working on this book. You know, I started writing this book all the way back in 2018, if you can believe it. So the fact that here I am, like, 7 years later, and all of this is going on it's so cool. And I feel so lucky to get to be a part of the Good Morning America book club. It's been such a great experience.
I mean, I think this is actually such a perfect illustration that there's no such thing as an overnight hit or sensation because, wow, you've been working on this since 2018. I know you also write personal essays. This is not the first thing that you've ever written. I'd love to actually hear about how you became a writer.
Sure. So it has been an interesting journey, kind of, you know, I think for most writers, it's often sort of this like bumpy time of figuring out yourself and your own identity through your writing. Junie is my first novel that I've ever finished. It's the first like big fiction thing that I ever did. I have written personal essays and things like that, mostly focused on my teaching career. That was usually what my essays kind of revolved around. So Junie was definitely a departure. But Junie's really special to me because it is based loosely on a family story of mine. It's loosely based on the story of my ancestor, whose name was Jane Cotton. She was my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother, so like a lot of grandmas back. And she escaped from slavery in Lowndes County, Alabama, which is not very far from where my family currently lives. So she actually escaped from a plantation in one county and ended up in the area that went on to become the town where my family still lives. So it was just this incredible story that my grandmother used to tell me all the time. And one day, it just happened to kind of stick with me in a different way. I was down there visiting my grandparents for Easter. My grandma did what she often did, which was, you know, retold family stories. And this one just kind of, I don't know what it is. I think it's that way with writers sometimes. Things just hit you in a new and different way all of a sudden. And I decided I wanted to kind of play around with this family story. And it evolved into Junie eventually. So, of course, the character of Junie, she's not identical to my ancestor in any way because we really don't know anything about my ancestor's life prior to her escape. So in a way, Junie was me imagining sort of what that might have been like and also what circumstances could have, you know, driven my ancestor to take such a, you know, dangerous and drastic step because, you know, she's in the heart of like the deepest version of the slavery antebellum cotton plantation South you can imagine. I mean, like it doesn't get deeper than Central Alabama. And for her to take such like a dangerous journey, it really, really stuck with me. And, you know, it was also something I thought a lot about because like that choice changed the trajectory of my family in such a major way. So I think that's also part of why I stuck with the project for this long and I really held on to it was that it was so near and dear to my heart in a different way. It wasn't just sort of like a random idea. It was something that felt meaningful in a bigger way. So I think that was a big part of driving me forward working on this
what
project.
was your process like over these years of working with the story? Like, how much research did you do? Because, like you said, there's not much actually known about your ancestor other than what happened after she escaped. But you grew up in Alabama, and so did you have to dig into like the archives, or like how much was like really historical based, and how did you fill in this character who clearly has personal meaning to you, right? And so, but also like transforming her, well, not really her, but like into a different character.
Absolutely. So in some ways, I there was a mixture of research as well as just sort of like family lore that came together in creating the story, of course, with just fiction and my own imagination. So the actual Jane Cotton, interestingly, lived to be like well over 100 years old, and she actually only died because she got hit by a horse and buggy crossing the street in town.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
like this woman lived a life, and so because she lived so long, um, her story kind of like filtered through the family more intensely than it would have otherwise. So interestingly, I was very heavily raised by my own grandmother. My grandmother was very heavily raised by her grandmother. And then that grandmother was heavily raised by Jane Cotton.
Oh,
So we had
okay.
this kind of like connection going back where I was able to almost get more information on this person from so long ago in my family history in a way that I probably wouldn't have otherwise because of just this family, this lineage and the way that this was just happened to happen. I did end up doing research though as well. I used a lot of my research would kind of come in when I was filling in the blanks. So one area that I definitely researched a good amount was specifically antebellum Montgomery, Alabama. I really wanted to look at what was just like this place like during that time because I wanted it to feel very regionally specific. I am also very lucky. My mom is a historian. So while
Very
my mom's
nice.
focus area isn't American history, she's like a historian. So she just kind of like, she's going to find out the history of wherever she is. So I had her as a great resource while my grandmother was still alive. She was a fantastic resource. My grandmother was a former teacher. She was like adored history, was always really into keeping up with that. My grandmother also was super into genealogy. She was like taking a genealogy class after she retired. Like she was super into it. So I was very lucky to have people in my family who were also supporting me in kind of getting some of those historical details right. I also read a lot of books that were also set during this time period. So things like Octavia Butler's Kindred. I read that while I was working on the book. I did read the vast majority of Gone with the Wind while I was working on this book because, to be honest, I just kind of wanted to see what like the other side was in this situation. I felt like it was important that I read, I tried to get through a good deal of books that were also set kind of in the antebellum South so that I could see how other writers handled it and treated the subject matter. So the research part was definitely a chunk of it, but I didn't want to let those like perfect historical, getting every single historical detail down to the absolute right, minutia. I didn't want it to hold me back from the fact that this is ultimately fiction and that this is ultimately a novel. I wanted to make sure the historical details were correct. I didn't want to have like an egregious anachronism or anything, but I also my goal with this was really to tell a good story and to really convey those characters as best as I could, and use the sort of history to like help that along.
Okay, so oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was gonna say tell our audience what Junie's about, and then like while you're doing that, if you're able to kind of show us where you decided to make those historical not changes necessarily, but like really, how do you decide like when you have done so much research, what parts you end up leaving behind, or what parts you let your writerly imagination like take over?
Sure. So Junie focuses on a 16-year-old enslaved girl on a plantation in Lowndes County, Alabama. And it's really a coming of age story at its heart. It takes place over the course of a year right before the start of the Civil War. Junie is serving as the maid to her like childhood friend, who is also the master's daughter. And in this role, Junie is in this complicated position with this person who she, on the one hand, considers a friend. This is Violet, the character Violet. She, on one hand, considers her a friend, but of course, this is like wildly complicated power dynamic. when news comes in that it's looking like Violet is going to be on track to get married soon, Junie comes to the realization that if Violet does marry, and move somewhere else, as is often, would commonly happen, that would also mean that Junie would be forced to leave her family behind, leave her home behind, and go wherever Violet happened to go. And in realizing that, Junie decides to commit a desperate act that ends up rousing the ghost of her recently deceased sister. And when the ghost of Minnie comes into the picture, everything really gets going. Minnie starts to lead Junie on a path towards settling her soul, because Minnie is kind of stuck between realms, and she's relying on Junie as her living sister to help complete these tasks that are going to help Minnie fulfill her sort of soul's mission and move on. So that all gets us started. Junie is a story, though, ultimately about, I believe, loss of innocence, about a character discovering really what love means within the context of such an abusive environment. It's a story of first love as well. Junie is kind of finding, and connecting with her first romantic love in this story, Caleb. So there's a lot there. I think there for everyone. In the character of Junie, I really wrote her to be a character that I wanted to be relatable emotionally to as many people as possible. I wanted people to be able to see themselves in her dreams, her flaws, her sort of like teenage angst, and her, desire, her consistent hope and desire for more for herself and for her loved ones. So in creating Junie, I wanted to ensure that those character elements were what were coming through. So I one element, for example, that I think was me making a choice that maybe isn't perfectly historically reflected or existed in history, but is not necessarily the norm, was that Junie is literate throughout the book. Junie is a big reader. She loves reading, and there's a reason in the story, which is that Violet is a big reader. And so when they're kids, Violet teaches Junie to read, because she's basically like, you are my assigned playmate, therefore you must like the things I like. So Violet teaches Junie how to read. It's still a secret. Like, Junie's not supposed to know how to read, but she does throughout the story. In general, slaves were not supposed to know how to read. That was definitely like pretty off limits. Although I think there are a lot of examples of enslaved people knowing how to read, learning through different means. That was an example of where I definitely diverged from the history. And I also diverged from my ancestor because my ancestor was not literate. But I felt like that divergence was going to add so much to the story, and was going to create a much more, interesting character, and also was kind of set the stage for a lot of different events that happen in the book without giving anything away. So that was a really important point for me. But then there were other historical details that I felt were super important to incorporate, where in my researching on slavery, I came across a lot of things that I personally just never learned in school, things that I think get glossed over. And I wanted to work some of those points into this story, where I wanted to find areas where I learned things that I felt like were not widely reflected, and incorporate them into the book. I can't give away what those things are, because once again, no spoilers, but that was something that was really important to me in writing this historical novel. Is I wanted to make sure I was bringing in history that was, different and unique, and I was kind of coming at it in a way that was different than the way other writers had.
Yeah, I really love that. And it's really interesting to hear about the choices that you made and why, because I think as every writer sits down to start a book, and even during the revision process, we have to decide, what we keep, right? And what serves the story. And related to that, so this is not just a historical novel, it's also historical speculative or historical supernatural, however you want to describe the genre, but not horror in any way, because there is a ghost. But how did you decide that having a ghost as a story driver, or as part of even the story that might have mucked up in some ways the genre, how did you decide that that was an important element for Junie?
I just personally really love ghost stories. I really enjoy the use of ghosts in literature, sometimes in like a spooky, genuinely scary way, but I also think ghosts are just really interesting, period. However they kind of pop up. I really enjoy books like Isabel Allende's House of the Spirits. I think that's a good example of where we get in some like weird ghost action that isn't scary ghosts, but it's more ghosts to bring kind of bring reality into better focus. I really love the usage of ghosts because I think that they serve as such a powerful, tangible way of representing a lot of intangible emotion. So In the case of this book, I think Minnie serves as a way of conveying grief, conveying rage, conveying the sort of like desire for liberation in a more kind of bodily way. And I believe it kind of gives Junie a better impetus for moving forward, to have Minnie be this sort of like more physical incarnation. I knew throughout that I wanted this book to kind of like mess with genre a little bit, just because like that's personally what I find interesting in books. And I was definitely writing this book to, I wanted to write a book that I personally was like, oh, I would want to read that, or like that is personally entertaining to me. And I've always loved the genre of magical realism. I've always really enjoyed books where that sort of magical element isn't necessarily like the full front of the story, but it's like under the surface. Things like Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing is such a good example of that, I think, as well, in terms of the usage of ghosts to sort of further the actual like real plot, like the reality plot, I guess. And I was really inspired by that book, I think, when writing this story, and the ways in which Jesmyn Ward uses ghosts throughout that book. And I think I wanted to kind of incorporate that in my own way in this story through Minnie's character. And that was really where the ghosts came in. It's just something I think I personally enjoy and wanted to play around with.
And was Minnie in the story from the very beginning, or was that something that you figured out later? Because I can also see a possibility where, as a writer, you're revising and you think, "Oh gosh, I need something else to help me move this plot forward, or something to give it structure."
Minnie has been in the story since very early, like very, very early on. There was always a ghost situation. I don't actually remember when I decided that there needed to be a ghost in the mix. Like, it's one of those things that I know it was in there from like the very, very earliest, but I don't remember what my moment was where I was like, ghost time. It's been in there since that's very much been part of the sort of like elevator pitch of the book. The whole time. I always knew that I wanted to do something with magical realism, and that I wanted to write something that fell into that sort of genre category. So I do think Minnie was always integral to this novel, and it's interesting because there have been moments of it going back and forth with some people being like, does the ghost need to be there? Can you take the ghost out and just do hard historical fiction and just call it that, call it at that? And I didn't really want to write a book that was hard historical fiction. I didn't want to write a book that was like just this one genre. I really wanted to kind of bend the two together. And that was always something that was going to be important to me in writing it, just because that felt authentic to me as a writer. But it's interesting. I wrote the majority of Junie. So I started in 2018. But I wrote the vast majority of the draft during COVID when I was in lockdown. So I was a teacher for 6 years. So at the time that I was writing this book and I was in lockdown, I was teaching on Zoom, and I was pretty much just like me and my cat alone in my apartment all the time. And with me and my, I got to this point where I was like, you know what, like I have this really cool opportunity with this book. Like I'm never going to have a better opportunity of just like complete isolation to be writing, like with just the least amount of distraction possible. So I really devoted a bunch of my time in lockdown to just like finishing this book, and really fleshing it out and figuring out what I wanted to do. So I was spending like every single night for like 3 months probably, just drafting and like setting goals for myself and trying to move the thing along. So there's a lot of this book that definitely, is reflecting that particular kind of like moment in my life as well, of me just in this very like insulated little environment, just like churning this out at like a desk next to my bed for a long time.
No, I mean, I love that. It's like, what else are you going to do? I guess I'll pursue my dream at this moment.
Yeah, I was like, I got nothing. I really can't go outside, can't go anywhere. So I was like, this is the zone. I'm never gonna have a better opportunity to focus on this than I do right this very second. So that was what I ended up doing. Was just really using that as my writing time, because I think as a writer, like I'm pretty easily distracted, unfortunately. And I can often find, reasons out there in the world to just, keep me procrastinating, basically. And so I think that this environment was really a good one for me, because it just was like, you have no you cannot procrastinate. There is nowhere
Right.
else to go. There is only so much Bridgerton you can watch. There is only there's a limit on everything. So it really became a good time for me to just like lock in and get it done and finish this story. And I'm so happy that it got completed.
Yeah, and
Editing
I
did take
mean,
a long time, but that's how books go. I think books are pretty much made in the editing process.
yeah, I think that's so true. I think people tend to overestimate how perfect or how complete
Mhm.
an early draft or even like a second draft needs to be. And I do that every single time with my books. I forget that I have so much more process, right? So it's important to take that pressure off. However, I want to fast forward now to recently because this book is, I mean, so I booked you on the podcast. I was super excited because I knew that I'd heard all the buzz. This book is going to be huge. And then you're on the GMA set. My husband just put his Kindle down the other day and it was on, the sleep mode screen. And like
Yeah.
Junie was on there, like with like just two other books as
Ooh,
like, yeah, the advertisement were for,
so cool. Oh, I
every
didn't know
time
that.
you walk by the Kindle. So yeah. Okay. So Creative Inspired Happy is not just a podcast. We're also an online community of writers and readers. And so I always try to give our audience a chance to ask questions ahead of time. So Sana W, she wanted to know, what were you doing at that moment when you found out that Junie was the Good Morning America book club pick?
So it was interesting. I was at my ceramic studio. I like on and off do ceramics. It's like my other little creative hobby. And I got a bunch of calls from my agent and my editor. I was just like getting a lot of buzzing where they were like, "Hello, can you hop on a call?" Like it was just like this very sudden, "We need you to get on a call." And so I remember like getting up from my ceramic studio. I was like covered in clay, had to go back to my house. And then I got there and, I ended up on this call with someone at Random House who at that time I had never met before. And they told me, they were like, "Oh, this is what's happening." And I was like, okay, it was really exciting. I was really, thrilled that it was happening. But it's crazy when you get picked for these book clubs because you find out a year in advance. So you're not like, it's not like you find out and then you're like going into it. It's literally you find out and then you're basically told to forget that this happened for the next like years. It's essentially like you can't tell anyone or tell as few, you like tell as few people as humanly possible
Mm-hmm.
and like keep it under wraps for a year. So, it's like you find out, but then you're also kind of like sitting on this for all this time. So, I had it over the course of like the year before my book comes out, I'm talking to people about all kinds of things, but it's like I'm so aware that there's this thing coming up in my life in months. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to go on live TV. In my head, there's like this ticker going on for a year where I was like 6 months till I'm on live TV. Okay. 3 months. Like, it's like this thing going off in my head for all this time. And, it's so exciting and cool, but it's really surreal as well. I'm so thrilled I got to be a part of the Good Morning America Club. They pick such awesome books.
Mm-hmm.
Like
They
so many
really
of the other books
do.
that have been in the club over the course of the last year have been really amazing, and I feel really lucky to get to be a part of it. But yeah, I was very excited, but I was like one combination of being like very excited and being like, oh no, I have a very big secret now.
I don't know how you could walk around and be a normal person. It's like you're like a shaken up bottle of champagne where there's like all these bubbles inside, and you have to look like everything's just normal. Yes, I'm mildly excited about this book. We'll see what
Yeah.
happens to
We'll
it.
see. There's a lot of like me shrugging and being like, but I was like, I had this information for all this time. So it was good. The people like very, very closest to me, like my parents and stuff like that, I told them, because it was one of those where I was like, there's no way, or like my husband, like I was like, there's no way I can keep this level of a secret for this
Right.
long from people who are in this level of like proximity to me. But even then it was still wild. It was it's yeah, it's such a cool experience. And it's really interesting to kind of like see it from the inside in that way.
Okay, so absolutely, let's dish. Please tell me, what was it like? Were you nervous? I mean, you said you had a countdown in your head to when you had to be on live TV. I want to know everything from like what happens when I don't know, how do you get to the studio? What happens when you're there? What's backstage? You know, Tell me everything.
Absolutely. So it is really cool backstage. It was very fun to be there. What happened is I'm lucky enough that I live in the city where they film, so that made a lot of things easier for me. I think that if you're out of town, there's a whole different dynamic that I'm personally not aware of. But for me, it was that I had this a lovely driver who came up and picked me up at 6:45 a.m. And with the lovely Tariq, I slept 0 hours, I want to say, the night before. And that's not like out of bad planning. Like I put myself to bed at an appropriate time, but I was genuinely just like laying in my bed staring at the ceiling for what felt like the entire night. It reached a point where it was like, forget it. This isn't happening. I am way too for sleeping. It felt like Christmas. It felt like being like a child on Christmas again. Like that was the closest thing that I could explain. It was the same feeling I would get as like a kid before Christmas. So I could not sleep. But got in the car around 6:45. You drive over to the studio, you get there. You're in Times Square, which is wild. Or I was in Times Square. There are like a few different studios where they film depending on like what day it is and how things go. I happen to be in Times Square, which is really cool because that's like I feel like the most iconic of the Good Morning America studios. And so I was really excited. I got to be there. I came in. You get there, there's like a big old Good Morning America sign on the elevator when you get inside. But it all goes really, really fast. Like it is quick. So you're like, I got there, I, dropped off my stuff, and then it was like straight to hair and makeup, where they're like putting on all my makeup and getting me all ready, and it's like all intense TV makeup. So you're like, in person, you look wild. In person, I was like, oh my goodness, I've never had on this amount of makeup in my life. But on camera, it looks really lovely. So it was really great to be able to have the actual makeup artist do your makeup there because they're such pros. And my makeup artist, her name was Renee, and she was like such an expert and just was so great. And that really made like a huge difference. But it was like as soon as I finished hair and makeup, you're off down the hall. I was with the lovely Kate, who's the person who's like kind of behind a lot of the Good Morning America picks. She's a producer there. And she read me through the questions I was gonna get asked. It's a 3-minute segment. So you're like going. And so it's like, here are your questions, here's what's gonna be asked, here's what's gonna happen. So I got maybe like a couple minutes to sort of prep my answers, think about what I was going to say before I went out there. And then it's like off to the studio and like, we're miking you and, you're whisked off. And what's really cool about the studio is that, it looks, I think on camera in those big news studios, it looks like they're like separate rooms, but it's actually just one room where they're just like moving the camera like this.
Oh,
so
wow.
That sort of like big like horseshoe desk is on one side, and then there's like Times Square behind you, and there's just like little sets that are, then it's just kind of a central camera that's moving. So I get there were like 20 Boy Scouts there before me, which was its own funny thing because there were just so many Boy Scouts and their parents who were at the studio at the same time. There were also puppies there the day I was there. Like there was so much. It was like wild. So they get me on to set during a commercial break. They're like, okay, get in the chair, go. So I hop in the chair. I was lucky in the sense that I got a little bit of time to talk to Junie, who is the host, who's my interviewer. I got a little bit of time to talk to her right before the cameras actually started rolling, which I think is nice because it's a little calming to be able to start your conversation before, rather than it just being like boom. But it's one of those where my whole thing was I just really tried to focus on the interviewer as much as I could and pretend that the cameras were not there.
That makes sense. Yeah.
It was like, okay, I'm just going to be having this lovely conversation and we're just going to pretend like there isn't a gigantic camera like right over there. But this over, everyone who I talked to about these experiences just told me that when you do live TV, you basically like black out and then it's over. And I would say that that's like kind of on point. It's not far off because it's such a short window of time that this insane thing happens and then it's like boop and it's over. And then after that, I took some lovely photos behind the scenes, met some cool people backstage, and yeah, I was back home by like, gosh, I think I was home again by like 9:30 a.m.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Your husband's like just finished eating breakfast.
Literally, like it was like, boom, I'm out of there. And I was back and it was live to tape, which was nice. So I was basically like, I filmed it and then I got home and then I watched it. So it came on after I had already, like I got to like see it come on at the time it came on. And then honestly, I was exhausted because, as I said, I had not slept at all the night before, and I'd been running on like adrenaline. And so I think I took like I slept some like really bizarre amount of time in the middle of the day, throughout the rest of the day. And yeah, that was what it was. But it was such a cool experience. I'm so glad I got to do that. And yeah, I really really enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's
I do think
amazing.
one thing I've said, is that I do think one of the reasons I was definitely nervous leading up to it, but actually when it started happening, the nerves started to fade. And I actually think that the reason that is because I was a teacher for so long. And I've said to a lot of people who've asked, like, well, how do you stay so composed when you're talking? How do you stay? And I'm like, I was a high school teacher for 6 years. And the thing about teaching is it's very similar to the idea of live TV. Like, no matter what's happening, no matter what you're feeling, no matter what's going on, your kids are walking in the room at this time, and you are expected to do whatever you need to do at this time. So, it doesn't matter what's going on in the world, how you're feeling, whether you're hungry, do you have a headache, are you nervous, is this lesson a mess? Like, it doesn't matter, because 30 children are coming into your classroom at 9 a.m., like, no matter what. So I think after having to do that, like, 4 or 5 times a day for 6 years, I am sort of used to this concept of like, okay, like we have to, turn it on. So
Right.
um, I think that it's funny with teaching and teachers, because I think that a lot of people don't think about the fact that being like a school teacher is really this public speaking job, and how much teachers are constantly in that role where we are, up there under wild circumstances. I always say that I feel like being a teacher is like being a stand-up comedian, except you're not funny and you're being heckled the entire time, every single. Like, your audience does not want to be there, and they are more than happy to let you know that they don't want to be there. But you still have to keep going regardless. So I feel like in a lot of ways that that time of, my job being a teacher, which I did, like, I adored it. I love being a teacher. But that like trial by fire of being a teacher really actually has been great preparation for a lot of this GMA stuff of, being ready to just like be out there. Cause at least with GMA, I'm like, oh my God, at least the people who are here are like excited to have me here and like want to hear what I have
It's
to say.
true.
I'm like, yeah, I'm used to a bunch of like 14-year-olds actively texting while I'm talking. Like, this is wild. This is so different. So yeah, it was really great.
That's incredible. If people in our audience are dreaming of their moment on GMA, what would your advice be for them besides maybe try to sleep the night before?
Biggest one, try to sleep. Yeah, 100% try to sleep. My other recommendation, this is deeply niche, but one thing that I felt like was super lovely for me in getting ready was that I was so nervous about what to wear, and thinking about how to, like, what kind of clothing I was going to wear, and going through my closet and figuring out what I was going to do. And I actually, this is not sponsored, but I used the service Newly to like rent clothes. And that was actually so lovely. And I think that it ended up being this great experience where I was able to like get, like pick out some rental clothes that I would not never buy for myself, but that would like be great for this experience. So those kind of things I think are really lovely, being able to like dabble in clothes that maybe you wouldn't otherwise wear or own for yourself, but like finding cool stuff. I think that made me personally feel a little bit more confident, that I was like, oh, okay, well, like I really like this outfit, so that's going to make me feel a little bit better. And then I think just really like knowing your book, which of course you do as the author. Like author, you know
I don't
know
know.
your thing.
Sometimes it's like it's been done for so long that you kind of
Yeah,
forget. And sometimes you're working on the next thing already. Like, I actually have to read my book again, or at least ask my husband or my daughter who's read it more recently before I do
yeah.
my launch events to be like, okay, who are the characters in this
Oh
book?
yeah. There are definitely certain moments where like there are niche bits of the plot now where I forget like when things happen at certain points. Or sometimes people will bring up a point to me and I'm like, is that this one, or like is it over? There's a little bit of that happening, but I think if you can really drill down your sort of like your pitch for your story, the big points you want to hit, which I think if you're working with a publishing house and you're working with like an amazing publicity team, as I was lucky enough to, they really help prep you for that. And I think the more that you can learn to sort of like rely on that practice and your instincts, that it makes it feel a lot more comfortable. And then of course, just like trying as much as possible to just think of it as an authentic conversation. I think that really helps. At least for me, I think that was what was most helpful in bringing me along through this experience.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Did you do any media training? Because I've heard that your publicist in-house, if you ask them, they can practice with you doing these interviews to help you, like you said, nail down what are these sound bites? What are the main, like, not selling points, but sort of selling points? You know, like what is this book about in a nutshell? What are the important ideas you want to convey? Because often these interviews are so short, whether it's GMA or, you know, elsewhere, or you're just trying to convince a bookseller, hey, you should stock my book.
Yes, they absolutely do. So, if you are going to have a big media thing, any sort of like major media stuff going on, they absolutely media train you. So I actually worked in PR before I like right out of college, a long time ago. But so I kind of knew those ins and outs a little bit. Going into it, of being like, oh yeah, I know what media training means. I know what this looks like, and how important those steps are. Because I used to have to do that for my clients when I worked in that industry. So I knew going in that like media training was going to be really essential. And I was lucky enough to have a team that did such a great job helping me out with that. And it is things like that. It's running possible questions. It's talking through things that might come up, like all of those things. So you're kind of mentally prepared for what kinds of questions people are going to ask. And I think that really helped move things along and help me feel more confident, is the more and more we could sort of drill down that concise statement of what Junie's about, or drill down the concise points that I really want to get across about why I wrote this book. All of those kind of things make you feel more confident in talking about it. So the team behind the scenes is so essential in helping you feel really confident.
Yeah, I think that's
And
perfect. I've also heard that if for some reason your in-house publicist can't do it, there's also people like freelance publicists or just people, you know, who you can hire for an hour to help you do media training, especially if you're not used to, I mean, like you said, you're a teacher, right? Or you were a teacher, so you're already used to doing that kind of public speaking. But I think a lot of writers, you know, we spend our times behind a desk,
totally.
and the people we talk to are other writers, and it's difficult to nail down this 400-page story, right, that you've created that's so rich, and how do you boil it down into an elevator pitch or just, you know, a few minutes? So I think that's super helpful advice. So thank you for running through that. I'm
Of
kind of
course.
curious, like, what's next? What are you working on? Or is it a secret? Or are you just touring and still doing publicity?
I am definitely writing, so I am working on some new projects. I was lucky enough to sign a 2 book deal with Valentine when I first signed for this book. So there is another book out there. I'm not currently giving away what that book is, but I am in the process of working on writing. So I have really been spending a lot of this. So I left teaching about a year and a half ago now. To focus full time on writing, whether it be Junie or this other project that I'm working on, and to just kind of devote my time for a bit to just being a writer and really focusing on getting these projects done. So I spent most of last year working on just the drafting of this next project that I'm doing, and also just sort of learning what life was like as a writer and kind of figuring out what that looked like for me. So I've been really focused lately on a lot of just the ins and outs of working on a book, and, you know, continuing to see it's so funny working on a second book, because, you know, when you were, it feels like, you know, you write your first one and you're like, oh my gosh, I did this thing. I can't believe I did it. And then all of a sudden, to the idea of like, okay, wait, I have to do this again, is this like that sort of like proving to yourself that it's possible to do this again is has been a really interesting situation for me. I think I spent a lot of last year, my husband can certainly speak to that, sort of like questioning and doubting myself, being like, yes, I wrote this other book, but like, could I possibly ever do this again? Like, how am I ever going to be able to, you know, push myself through this whole thing again? So I'm still in the process with this book. I luckily have finished a draft, thank goodness. So like drafts are there. We're there, but now we're in, you know, editing land. So I am really hopeful that readers will be able to learn more about the book, hopefully soon. I'd love to share it as, as soon as she's ready. And I really hope people will enjoy it. I'm very excited about it. So
I'm very excited that you're already done with the draft, because for me, that's the worst part, is when I don't have like at least a first draft. And once I have a first draft, I feel comfortable, like, okay, there is enough for something that will become a book someday. And then we just have to massage it. But speaking of your next book and when you're going to announce it, where can people find you online?
Sure. So I am mostly on Instagram right now, it's just my name. So it's Erin Crosby Eckstine on Instagram. I think I'm on Threads as well. I'm on Blue Sky as well. So you can kind of like Google my name. I'll pop up. I will be there. And yeah, those are the main places to find me. You can also find my website for any updates on things like events and any news I have that comes up. It's just erincrosbyeckstine.com. So easy to find me if you just look up my name.
Fantastic. I will include all those details in the episode notes as well, if anyone just wants to scroll and click and connect with you online. And definitely check out Erin's Instagram, because that's where the Good Morning America photos are. And there's a reel too, I believe. So
yes. And I have every intention of posting some more little tidbits of author debut times and Good Morning America and all kinds of little author behind the scenes bits. I'm really loving being able to like connect with readers now and actually talk to people about the book. And I'm really looking into finding new ways to connect with people out there, talk more about reading and writing and all of these sort of processes. So I love hearing from people.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. This has been so fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great. I love getting a chance to like talk to other writers as well and talk about the process. It's so lovely.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.